There we go. Good morning. How's everybody doing? Feel free to open those windows because it's hot as heck in here. And it's going to be, that one, no, not that one. That one sadly does not open. And I would really hate for you to put your arm through a pane of glass. Which has happened. Yeah, see the one on the left there? How clean it is by comparison? Right? Horrible. All right, wood finishing. Wood finishing is so much its own thing that, frankly, I could teach a semester-long class just on finishing. People make entire careers out of doing this without any woodworking, just having it be a supplemental thing. So, be aware. Wood finishing takes time. It takes specialized knowledge. What I'm going to go over with you guys today is kind of what your options, what the main options are, but you also got to remember that anything that you can do to anything, you can probably do to wood. So if you're thinking, well, I want it to be a color, what kind of paint do I use? We'll talk about that. You can paint it, you can burn it, you can stain it, you can do all sorts of things with it. There isn't really a right answer or a wrong answer to an extent. There are a few things that you need to remember, though, about wood finishing. Why do we do it? That's the big one. What is the whole function of wood finishing? Can anybody venture a guess? There's probably 2 or 3 main reasons why we do it.
To preserve the wood.
To preserve the wood? Preserve it from what?
Water.
Sure.
Humidity.
Protection. Well, protection here. It protects. It protects, like you were saying, from water, but it also protects from dirt. The wood itself, gets filthy if you are just allowed to handle it, right? That space in between all the fibers can collect as much junk as you can throw at it. And it's going to end up looking really grubby really quickly. So it keeps dirt away. Moisture exchange is another really, really big one. So protects from dirt, water. Moisture exchange is the big one, water. So the idea is that when you put a finish on something, you're starting to inhibit the ability of moisture to go into your project and leave the project. Of course, that exchange is the thing that makes your project want to move, right? So as we seal it up, it's still going to do it. Wood is never going to stop moving, right? But it's going to be able to do it less. That's important. So to that end, you should understand another really pretty big thing here, which is that if you're going to put a finish on some portion of your project, everything needs to have a finish on it. So even if there's a bottom or a back or an interior, you're not just putting finish on what's visible. You finish the entire thing. Think about it almost like an egg, An egg is extremely strong, and I don't want to say uncrushable, but it's not easy to crush when it exists in its fully supported state. As soon as you kind of compromise that, you can just, same idea. You want to cover the entire thing, inside, outside, whatever. No naked spots. Believe it or not, the last thing that it really protects from is damage from contact. Wood dents really easily, you may have noticed. Finishes can make it so that the surface has less friction on it. Things can slide off of it. It can harden the surface just a little bit, so wear and tear also kind of bounces off. Those are the big reasons why we, there's one more though, other than protection. It makes it pretty. It beautifies. Finished wood, typically speaking, is better looking than unfinished wood. So it enhances your material a lot while it's doing all of this other stuff as well, right? Those are kind of the big ones. All right, so within that, here is your range of options. There's actually more options than this. And not all of these, a lot of the things that I've pulled out here are not the shops. Everything that the shop has available to you is going to be in that yellow combustibles cabinet in the finishing room. Quick reminder, if you go in there for something, you need to make sure the door of the combustibles cabinet is closed again after you've gone into it. Don't leave it wide open. It doesn't do anybody any good as a combustibles cabinet at that point. So, keep that closed, all that good stuff. Before I go too far into it, though, I want to talk about this book right here. This is Understanding Wood Finishing by Bob Flexner. Oh my goodness. This is the authoritative tome on wood finishing. If you have a question about wood finishing, this book has the answer in it. Legit. I thought it was going to be boring and dry, and then I read it and was like, I read it like a friggin' novel. I'm not even kidding. I was like, fascinating. Seriously. So if you have any questions about anything, right here, it is going to be sitting on the back shelf. Right here. And if it disappears for some reason, just check the advanced room. They might have walked off with it. Okay? But based on the knowledge that is in that book, we can talk about finishes in three main categories: oil, water, and spirit. The really big one is oil-based finishes. Those are some of the oldest finishes around, right? Typically speaking these days, oil-based finishes are made up, well, let me back up a little bit. You can tell what the foundation of a finish is by what it's solvent in, for example. So, water-based spirit or finishes are cleaned up with soap and water, right? Spirit-based finishes usually are cleaned up with denatured alcohol or acetone or lacquer thinner or one of those evaporative finishes. Oil-based finishes are almost always going to be cleaned up with mineral spirits. So depending on what you see on the label of whatever it is, like clean up with mineral spirits, it's an oil-based finish. Other solvents for oil-based finishes are kerosene, methyl ethyl ketone. No, that's spirit. I take it back. Kerosene, turpentine. And remember, mineral spirits and paint thinner are the same thing. So if it's like clean up with paint thinner, that's mineral spirits. It's a different grade from what I understand, but like that's really the only difference. So if you ever are in any doubt of what you're working with, just check out what the cleanup protocol is for it, and that will tell you. But like I said, oil-based finishes are the most common and the most sort of historically applied. There's a really good reason for that. Oil in and of itself as a material has existed for as long as wood has, right? But depending on the kind of oil, it has particular properties that are really, really useful in woodworking. We use mostly linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, which comes from flax. It's called boiled linseed oil because back in the day they used to apply heat to it and then add chemicals to that to get it to cure faster. Mostly heavy metals, that kind of a thing. Now it's been put through a chemical process that does something similar that isn't actually an application of heat to it, but it's still referred to as boiled linseed oil. Linseed oil that doesn't have any of that stuff added is called raw linseed oil. Okay? The raw stuff takes forever to cure. The boiled stuff doesn't take nearly as long. So even though it's still called that, just remember it hasn't actually been boiled. It's just this reference to additives that are on there. You'll also notice that I immediately put on gloves before I started in on this demo. That's just because, you know, these chemicals ultimately are not great for you. Some of them are known to cause cancer in the state of California. Others of them are known to cause cancer in the rest of your body. Who knows? I just like to be on the safe side when it comes to handling this stuff in particular. Most of the time the water-based stuff is going to be pretty inert and is not going to hurt you, but you know, the heavy metal additives that are in this stuff, if you absorb it through your skin, you can get metal poisoning. You can get all sorts of things, so wear your gloves. Which leads me to, what kind of gloves? There's so much information you guys are going to get today. You should be writing furiously, incidentally. If you are not writing furiously, you are not, yeah, you're depending on my video then to come back and revisit. You need to wear either nitrile or butyl gloves. Nitrile or butyl, B-U-T-Y-L. If you have latex gloves, latex is broken down in oil. Nitrile and butyl are not. With that said, they're still going to break down, especially if you're going to have a lot of chemical exposure to them, so you can wear, you know, be prepared to put on multiple pairs. In years past, the gloves have been an art cash item. This year with COVID, we've been given lots and lots of boxes of gloves. Awesome. So you're going to find boxes of nitrile gloves at the back of this room, in the machine room right outside my office, and just sort of like around. So be prepared. Try to find the pair that fits you the best. For example, I'm wearing smalls. Okay. Yeah, find the pair that fits you the best though. If for whatever reason there is not a pair that fits you, you can make them fit by taking the back of the glove and twisting it and putting a piece of tape over it. And it'll all kind of like shrink up and, you know, be close to your hands. The reason you want to do that is you don't want your glove dragging through your finish as you're working. It's going to mess everything up for you. So these are the first things. So oil, why is it such a great finish? Why do we all use it and think it's the shiz? Well, because it oxidizes. When oil oxidizes, it hardens and it darkens. So if you put nice liquid oil onto a piece of wood, you know, kind of let it soak all in, whatever, buff off the extra, do that a couple of times. The oil that gets into the fibers, it's going to penetrate really deeply, and then as it cures, it's going to harden a little bit. And when it does that, it makes the fibers a little bit translucent, so suddenly the surface has a lot of depth in its appearance. And then it darkens a little bit with sunlight especially, and with oxygen. And so the piece that you have, instead of being kind of dull and whatever, suddenly is really luminous. It's almost like polishing a stone, right? And because it does harden those fibers a little bit, it gets in there and it displaces the air and the moisture, it protects it from a huge amount of moisture exchange. It's good stuff. And it's pretty straightforward. You put your oil on, you let it soak in, you buff off the extra, you let it sit, you do it again, you let it sit, whatever. You can also thin the oil out to make it penetrate better, just by taking, you know, We've got jars in the finishing room with lids. Jars in the finishing room with lids. You can, put 2/3 oil in one and 1/3 of mineral spirits in it. And that's going to make it a little bit thinner so that it's going to be able to penetrate further faster. Make sense? I have actually created a finish here that we will talk about that is a mixture of things for us to compare in a second. Move along, son. I'm watching him. Get. There he goes. All right. So oil is like the oldest and easiest. Along that same line, well, let me just say too that not all oil is appropriate for wood finishing. Some oils do not cure very, very quickly, if at all, or they don't cure very hard. So for example, like mineral oil, we will use a lot for things that need to be food safe. Cutting boards, kids' toys, things like that. But mineral oil doesn't ever cure hard. So it doesn't protect in that regard. It still displaces the water, which is really pretty important, but it's not going to actually make something like more durable. And it's a finish that has to be replenished pretty regularly as an object is getting used. Any kind of food-based oil, cooking oil, walnut oil, olive oil, those will go rancid after a time. They'll rot. So that's also not always super appropriate for wood finishes unless you're going to completely seal it over with something else. For the most part, boiled linseed, it's the way to go. And if you need to do something food safe, you use mineral oil, which you can buy for like $1 at the drugstore in the like continence care section, because it's a laxative. So if you're like not embarrassed about buying a big bottle of laxative, you can get what is referred to as butcher block oil for a mere fraction of the price, because it's just about packaging. Legit, all it has in it is mineral oil, maybe a little bit of beeswax, not a big deal. So a long time ago, people also figured out that you can make your oil even harder if you add resin to it, right? So when they're cooking up their oil to make it do the thing, they started putting tree sap into it, like pine resin, stuff like that. And as they cooked it, that became what is commonly now referred to as varnish. That's all varnish is oil that's been cooked with a natural resin. So, under oil-based finishes, we've got boiled linseed oil. Can't spell. Actually, can't write in my gloves. Boiled linseed oil. Varnish. So, you have to also understand when I start talking about finishes with you, if I use a specific term, I mean that specific thing. So if you're talking to me about varnishing your project, I'm going to assume you're talking about using varnish. If you talk to me about staining your project, I'm assuming that you're talking to me about stain. If you're talking to me about finishing your project, I assume you're talking to me about all of these things. So just remember, if I say a particular term, I'm talking about that particular finish. So that'll save you some confusion down the road there, okay? In terms of varnish, most of the time these days, it's not actually a thing anymore. Like, people are still manufacturing old-fashioned varnishes, but those natural tree resins have really given way to man-made polymers. Specifically, wait for it, polyurethane. Polyurethane is a plastic. Yay! Most of the polyurethanes here, where are they? I got 3 of them. Boom. The polyurethane typically will come in 3 different forms: spray, regular, and wiping. again, this is where that book comes in really handy. Like, it demystifies all of this nonsense for you in terms of like, well, what's the difference? Honestly, the difference between these two things right here is viscosity. This one is slightly thinner than this. That's it. That's the only difference. So if you're thinking to yourself, but I need a wiping finish, and all I have is this. Well, guess what, kids? All you got to do is thin this a little bit, and you've got a wiping finish. And what do you thin it with? Spirits. Dear God. See where we're going with this? Hey. So varnish is a combination of oil and polymers, right? It's oil and resin, right? And then you've got polyurethane, which is in and of itself it's a synthetic resin. So here's the thing, polyurethane does not penetrate. It's a top coat. It's like a candy shell on the outside of an M&M. So if you're thinking to yourself, I want my wood to look sexy and dark and translucent and shiny, the only thing that the polyurethane is going to do to accomplish that is the shiny. It might darken it a little bit, but it's not going to really, really enhance the appearance. It's just going to protect. So this is just a top coat. This is important to remember, because if you think to yourself, well, I'm just going to throw some poly on it and it's going to be good, if you really want it to look gorgeous, you should oil it first. Oil and poly. That's the golden kind of like application right there. So you oil it, you have to let the oil completely cure before you can top coat it. So it's a long process. Excuse me. For the sake of critique, if like you're probably going to want to oil your project, for example, or oil and poly, as long as you have the oil applied, you can wait to put the polyurethane on until it's totally cured up. I'm not going to be like, your finish has to be completely finished if it's one of these like many, many multi-step, multi-week things, which is what this is. Because you have to let the first one cure before you put the other one on, otherwise, bleh, it's bad news. Polyurethane, yes, just a top coat, yes.
How long does it take to cure?
It depends, and I'll get to that in a second. But that does raise a really good point, which I'm going to tell you about everything on here. A lot of you are going to ask me, how do I do this? How do I put this on? How do I apply this? How long does it have to dry? All of that good stuff. I want you to hear me now and take this to heart. Read the can. I do not know off the top of my head what the cure times are for these products. Read the can. The can is going to tell you pretty much all you need to know in terms of application, temperature requirements, because that is a thing, humidity requirements, because that's also a thing, and cure time. So do me a favor, and before you ask me a question that there is an answer to on the can, read the can. It might answer your question for you. That and the good people at the companies that manufacture this stuff have spent a lot of money on R&D so that the cans are as clear as possible. They want this to be as user-friendly as possible. So the time when it starts to get confusing is when you start mixing finishes, which is a thing. You can totally do that. For example, this guy right here, Japan Dryer, is an additive that you can add to your oil-based finishes to speed cure time. You can't add too much of it because you can see from the top here that it's kind of a purple color. It will change the color of your finish if you add too much of it. This is actually something that you can add to even like oil paint for like painting interiors. And they say the same thing, like no more than I think a tablespoon per gallon, because otherwise it's going to change the color of your paint to like have a purple cast. But it accelerates the cure time for anything oil-based. So remember when I said you could take boiled linseed oil and add a little bit of mineral spirits to it to make it thinner? Well, you can also add a little bit of this to it to make it faster. Ooh. If you do make your own finish for whatever reason, that's fine, but you need to label the jar. You need to say, this is what I've made, here's what's in it, in what proportions, and then the date that it was made. And sealed jar in the finishing cabinet. We'll talk about this specifically in just a minute. There's another common top coat that we use in this class, and that is spar urethane. Spar urethane, I'm not entirely sure what the actual difference is, but I know that in terms of like its chemical composition, but in terms of its function, spar urethane was formulated, or spar varnish was formulated specifically for exterior use. So you like benches that live out in the park, or a wooden door exterior kind of a thing. The benefit of it is that it has UV protectant in it, so that if you don't want your wood to change color quite as quickly, or you don't, whatever, it's there for you. You got it. The other benefit of that is that because it's intended for outdoor use, it's a little bit flexible, so that as the wood changes size, as it's, exposed to weather, in theory, the finish doesn't just come peeling off of things after a year. So, spar urethane. I use spar urethane a lot when I am making my own finish. This right here is called Mama's. This is my magical finish. This is based off of a recipe that a couple of old timers have been using for decades. A woodworker named Sam Maloof, who was a really incredible, mostly chair maker, and then another guy named Jerry Osgood. They would make their own finish, and that's essentially what this is. Mama's has all of the benefits of an oil and a varnish combined, because that's what's in it. So this gets used a lot, and you can always make more if you run out. So Mama's has in it spar, like 1 part. Linseed oil, boiled, also 1 part. Mineral spirits, I'm actually going to say is 1 1/4 parts of these, proportionally speaking, and like 0.7 and like 0.75 parts of mineral spirits to thin it out. And then in a jar this size, maybe 1.5 tablespoons of Japan dryer. And then Japan dryer, a splash. I'm going to say 1%. That is what's in Mama's. There are other oil top coat combinations. Probably the most popular is what's called Watco Danish oil. If it's something oil finish, it's got resins in it, which I realize is, not super descriptive, but there's oil and oil finish. Oil is oil. Oil finish is oil with resin in it. So if you're ever confused, that's the difference. What I have been finding with the Watco, I used to buy it in huge amounts, is that it would separate out and go bad really fast. So instead of continuing to buy this, we've just started making this. And it's cheaper. That's the other beauty of it. It's way cheaper to just buy big gallons of things and make it yourself. When you're applying Mama's, what you do is you take your rags. Incidentally, we have rags for you. They are in my office. They are also an art cash item. They're 50 cents each. And when you buy them, the first thing you're going to want to do is subdivide them into much smaller sizes. Like, I do not need this much rag to do a finishing activity. I would probably cut this into at least quarters, if not something even smaller. But what I would do is I would take my rag and I would saturate it in the finish, really work it into the surface, and to the point where it's still kind of wet looking, but not like dripping or anything. And then I would let it sit for half an hour to 45 minutes. And then I would come back with a clean rag and buff it back. I'd let that cure overnight to 2 or 3 days, and then I would do a second coat to get it to kind of penetrate further. At that point, I would probably stop using Mama's as my main finish, because you've kind of sealed up the whole thing at that point. And if I needed to build more protection on top of it, I would just use the spar urethane. And then build that from there. I know, it's so much information. It's so much, and it's only going to get worse. I'm so sorry, but it's true. So, Mama's is where it's at. It's good stuff. You can make your own. You can take it home with you. You can do whatever. Any questions so far? Yes?
What was the first type of polyurethane called again?
Oh,
Canister?
the stuff, just spray.
Not the spray, the small canister.
Oh, regular.
Just called regular?
Yeah, I think they usually refer to it as brushing poly. Usually when it comes in a can, it's a brushing finish as opposed to either a spray finish or a wiping finish.
Okay.
So the differentiation obviously being the way it's applied. There are a few more kind of finishes that you should know about within this subcategory, but it's hard to actually like break all of this information down in a lot of ways because there's a lot of crossover as well, but I'll do my best. I promise. Before you top coating is typically the very last thing that you do, right? So you can have augmented the wood before you put the top coat on though. You can paint it, you can color it, you can oxidize it, you can do any number of things, right? So that top coat's the last thing. Before the top coat, the oil-based things that I want to show you are stain and stain, essentially. In the past, I have been very anti-stain. My opinion has evolved as I have done a little bit more woodworking. The thing that used to happen a lot is that people would buy their cheapest wood that they could and then try to stain it to look like expensive wood. And it just looks like crap when you do that. If you take poplar and you say, I'm going to stain it to look like mahogany, it will never look like mahogany. It will look like stained poplar. And that's fine. It can look like stained poplar. That's a perfectly legit thing. But it's not something that, it's not a costume that the wood can put on to be, like, convincingly become something else. It's just a thing that's going to augment what all of the natural qualities of the wood has. Stain also tends to look better on wood that's a little more open-grained. So when people go to stain poplar, which is pretty consistent and tight, it doesn't look that great most of the time because it's not depositing pigment in those open pores. It's just sort of sitting on top and making it look pretty muddy. The way that liquid stain works, and I'm not going to open this up just because I don't feel like it, is that there is kind of two parts to the stain. There's a suspension, a liquid suspension that is one color, and then there's a pigment, like gel paste kind of thing, that's another color. And it's the combination of like mixing those things up, rubbing it on the wood so that the paste in the bottom deposits in those open pores, and then the suspension itself kind of sits on top. That gives it its color. Hooray, that's how it works. The thing that people tend to forget though is that end grain is an open pore, essentially. So if you're staining something that has a lot of contours, or, you know, like if you were to stain the boat, for example, as it was going around to the front of the bow, all of a sudden, that's all open pores there, right? And it's gonna change color. It's gonna be kind of one shade, and then it's gonna get really, really dark. And you're gonna be like, why did that happen? So that's one of the other things that people tend to forget about stain, is that it deposits differently depending on the cut of the wood. And doing it consistently and making it look good involves additional steps as well. So I tend to only use stain if I am trying to correct for a set of differences within the wood itself. If I'm trying to unify a surface, this can really help for doing something like that. You know, or maybe if the wood just isn't very good to begin with and it doesn't matter if I'm pigmenting it, something like that. In that same vein, there is a product that Minwax makes called Polyshades, which is a stain and polyurethane combination. In the past, they have radically improved the formula for this. Radically, radically. It is not nearly as horrible as it used to be. This used to be the ugliest finish known to mankind. Like, people would put this on their projects and be like, I thought I was saving time. And it was like, you were painting it with Jell-O. It's terrible. This has improved. In fact, this is my can of Polyshades that I've been using to restore some of the woodwork in my house, because, you know, that's what I've been doing. Again, as its own finish, I don't think it's particularly great, but I've been using it a lot in furniture restoration and repair to make things match and to make things bond at the same time. You know, just be aware it's not a shortcut. It's not probably going to save you any time if you're trying to make things look good and get it done on time. I would rather you just do it the right way and do it slower and not have your finish be entirely done for critique day. Cool? Makes sense? The last oil-based finish I'm going to show you before we move on to water-based stuff is wax. Wax. Oh yes. Wax comes in all kinds of forms. This happens to be Howard's Bean Wax. This lovely orange-smelling kind of gel that comes in a thing here. Wax in and of itself is not a great finish unless you're doing something that's like food safe. Again, you know, in which case you're going to want to use a food-safe wax, like beeswax. The thing that wax will do, though, just like when you're polishing a car, you know, like you've washed your car, you've waxed it, the wax is filling in all those little inconsistencies in that surface and making it more reflective. That's what wood wax does, too. So if your surface isn't perfect, you can wax it and make it look really pretty nice. It kind of it fills in all those little tiny inconsistencies. It's also super protective. I will frequently wax things that have a polyurethane on them just to make it a less impact, like, how do I put it? It reduces friction, so if I drop something on it, the wax actually might make that thing slide instead of just bounce, for real. So it has that benefit as well. A very, very typical traditional finish back in the day would have been oil that's been cured and then wax. Partly because it's endlessly like renewable, you can kind of keep building that finish over the years if the wood seems like it's drying out. Also because it's very simple to apply. It's good stuff. So here I'm going to tell you the other gigantic secret about wood finishing. And this is going to apply to everything. You really only ever read whatever that top layer is. So if you've applied a whole bunch of different kinds of finish, and the last one you apply is something else, the one that the appearance that it's going to take on is the one of that last layer. This is going to become important when we talk about polyacrylic in a minute. You're only going to read the top layer. It's a really good thing. Questions about oil-based finishes? So remember, oil penetrates and oxidizes. Top coats seal up like a candy shell. Waxes kind of buff out the inconsistencies. Those are kind of the big three for you to remember there. All right. Water-based finishes. We're going to talk about water-based finishes, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and talk about spirit finishes. Water-based finishes are very naturally water cleanup, soap and water cleanup. Very obviously, because we ourselves are water-based, they tend to be things that are much safer for us to use, right? A water-based finish, you know, usually isn't off-gassing things that are really noxious, typically aren't cancer-causing, anything like that. It's all good. They have their drawbacks, though, in terms of appearance. So if our oil-based finishes look really beautiful and oxidize our wood really nicely and whatever, the water-based finishes don't. The big, most common top coat water-based finish is polyacrylic. I'm going to warn you guys right now that I have spent our entire budget already, and so if we don't have something for you to use in the finishing room, you need to get your own. Sorry. So I can tell you right now that this polyacrylic, apart from the fact that this was my can, we don't have any more of it in the finishing room. So if it is something that you want to use, you're going to need to go to Lowe's and pick it up. Polyacrylic, what would be the benefit other than non-toxicity? Well, because it's water-based, it's non-oxidizing. So if I've got a project that is a really intense color and I want to maintain that color, or like maybe I made something out of, let's say I made it out of ash, which is kind of a pale colored wood, and I want to keep it as pale as I can over the years, I'm going to put a water-based finish on it because it doesn't have the oil in there to be a catalyst for oxidation. It's still going to darken because, frankly, that's what wood does. It still is responsive to light, it's still responsive to the air, but this will inhibit it just a little bit. So, polyacrylic. I'm spelling so bad. It's the gloves, they're making me spell poorly. So polyacrylic doesn't oxidize. The drawbacks are that this looks like plastic. When you polyacrylic something, you are essentially putting on a layer of acrylic paint that has no pigment in it. It's just this acrylic medium. So the end result looks really synthetic and really, really plasticky. Now, the benefit, here's where what I said before about what wax matters. Remember, you only ever read the top layer. So you could polyacrylic the heck out of something for all of the properties that you want it to have, and then put your wax over the top of that, and as long as you have like refined your finish below it enough, it's going to look like a beautifully waxed wood surface. Ooh. See where I'm going? You can take advantage of the properties of these finishes for what their function is while still imparting a different appearance on it. Very important. Yay. Or you can take advantage of the fact that it looks plasticky. If you guys go up to the gallery right now, the OMAS show is up. Steve Burdine, who was intro last semester, has a little cabinet in there. It's yellow. It's got a couple of little drawers in it, and it is super duper plasticky feeling. And that's because he took this polyacrylic and he applied it many, many times, and he wet sanded it with 400 in between, like he was, like, again, like finishing a car, so that it just built up this like sleek plastic appearance, you know? Anyway, so for what that's worth, there's that. This also leads me to, this is a valuable segue, regardless of finish, that you should also understand, and that's that all finishes naturally occur in high gloss. Okay? Everything starts as high gloss. In order to make a finish less glossy, in order to make it satin or eggshell or matte or whatever, matting agents are added to the finish. Usually it's some kind of really fine, like bead or particle, and what it does is it breaks up the light and refracts it and makes it look duller. That's really important to know if you want to have a super sexy looking object, because, bear with me for a minute, let's say that you want a really heavily protected, let's use your box as an example. Let's say you want to put like 10 coats of finish on it to make it really, really sing, right? But you want the end result to be kind of satin, not shiny. If you put 10 coats of satin finish on that, it's going to get cloudy because there's matting agents in all of those layers, and it's actually going to obscure the appearance of your wood over time. But do you remember what I said? You only ever read the last one. So if I was going to do that, I would do 9 coats of high gloss because there's no matting agents in them and it's clear. And then the very last coat I would do in that satin. I know, it's so dry. It's such a boring / interesting subject, right? It's like, to me it's endlessly fascinating because this is what I do, but yeah. But it's little things like that that are going to end up making a difference. And those have real life applications, believe it or not, especially for those of you who are in the trades. Like, if you are in a house and they're trying to refurb something, and, you know, when I worked in cabinet shops, that was a big issue. At one point, an entire, like, $3 million kitchen got returned because the person wasn't paying attention and put all these coats of semi on there, and you couldn't see the wood, and it was like some really crazy expensive thing, and we had to remake it. That sucked. But anyway, just be aware, that's a thing. And you can use it to your advantage, because you only ever read the top coat. All right, among our other water-based finishes are paints. So a lot of you are going to probably want to paint your projects, right? Bandsaw boxes are not, like, they have a lot of seams. They tend to not be the most, like, glorious wood-based thing unless you're taking advantage of the, you know, the material, the way that you're doing, Chris. Paint is often the way to go. Yes, you can use oil paint on your stuff, but you got to remember that oil paint has an extended cure time on there. So if you're like, I'm in painting class and I've got oils and I'm going to paint it with oils, your project's not going to be dry when you turn it in. I guarantee it. It's just not. Most of the time, instead, what you're going to be using are water-based paints. I have some paint for you guys to use. Some. Very little. What I do have for you is going to be back in that brown cabinet at the back of the room there. Acrylic is probably the most common paint that you can apply to your projects. You know, you can pick up acrylic paint at Walmart. We've got acrylic over in the bookstore. The quality of acrylic paint is extremely disparate, though. Like, at the very low end, you got the stuff that you get at Walmart, that, like, old-fashioned country, like, the bottles, you know what I'm talking about? Yo, the craft paint. And then at the very other end of the spectrum is this brand right here, Golden. So even though it's not a color, Golden is the brand. Golden acrylics are where it's at. And they're expensive. But the difference is in the quality of the pigment and the pigment load in here. Like, I can really make something look good with not as much paint with Golden acrylics as I can with the other end of the spectrum. That said, I don't expect anybody to buy this stuff. Like, this is mine. But you should know that there is a range. Right in the middle is Liquitex. It's better than the other stuff, but it's not as good as this. So just be aware that there's all sorts of things. So what do they look like? What are their working properties? For example, what is on this box here that I showed you guys before, right? This is my Jenna Goldberg bandsaw box. This is actually a kind of paint called Roscoe Scenic Paint. It's used in theater. Scenic paints naturally have enormously high pigment loads, because remember, you're painting on something and it has to be really, really visible and vibrant from an entire theater away, right? In this case, these are sort of translucent paints that she's put on here, but like, you can see how heavily pigmented this is just for this like really thin layer of paint that's on here. The golden acts kind of similarly. That's part of why I like it as much as I do, and it's not as hard to come by. You have to special order Roscoe paints, and they actually will mold really fast. You have to like add Lysol to them to keep them like viable. But my point with this is that paint, when thinned, can be applied like a stain. You can just glaze it on there and, you know, do whatever with it. And any kind of water-based paint will work like that. House paint, you could thin out house paint. You could not thin out house paint and just straight up paint something. You can, believe it or not, you can use watercolors. I think I have a watercolor palette in here somewhere. Incidentally, all of the paint that I have available to you, you can see it, it's right there. It ain't much. So if you really want something to look good, I would suggest getting your own, you know, whatever. But you can also see the difference on this box, that the handle is more opaque looking than the box itself is. That's because some of these paints are different degrees of opacity. You have to pay attention to that when you are picking out your material or when you're getting ready to paint. I brought these two bottles of Golden out very specifically because they do this really cool thing with their label where they've got black bars printed across them, and they take the actual paint and they spread it across the label to show you its opacity. So this red oxide is an opaque paint. And quinacridone burnt orange here is semi-translucent. See that? So those paints are going to act really, really differently, even though there are very, very similar colors. One is going to just like be this, and the other one I'm going to be able to use to tint and change other things. Typically speaking, the more translucent a color is, the more you can add it to other things and have it be like a good augmenting paint, as opposed to a good base paint. The more opaque a paint is, the more like unchangeable it wants to be. I can show you an example right here. I did this last semester. This stripe right here is that the opaque one. What is it? Red oxide. And I've thinned it with water as I've drawn it this way. This is that quinacridone, quinacridone burnt orange. So it starts out an almost identical color, but when I add water to it and I thin it, it turns into this. So be aware that your paint might not just be like a color, especially if you're using something halfway decent. It might have all of these other qualities that you can take advantage of. Like how awesome is it that this changes from like orange to yellow? You know, this one's boring as hell. This is really kind of interesting. So just remember, that's the thing. And the higher quality your paint, the more you're going to be able to mess with it and do cool shit. Let's see, what else do I have here? You can also take straight up paint and just thin it out and use it as a stain. That's what's going on right here. This is blue acrylic that I just added water to, and depending on the density of how you apply it, you can still then see the wood grain through it, right? And do a sample before you touch your own project, for heaven's sake. Why on earth would you ever put pen to paper before knowing what you're going to do, right? Or what it's going to look like. There are several other common paints that people are using for wood. Chalk paint is a really common one these days. You can get this, of course, at any old Walmart, at least the Waverly stuff you can, or at like Trends and Treasures sells different kinds of chalk paint right inside the door. The beauty of chalk paint is that it really does stick to almost anything, and it has a matte finish, so you don't have to be super like accurate in your application for it to look pretty good. I actually have been, in my quote-unquote spare time, slapping a little extra chalk paint on this whenever I kind of feel like it. So you can see, this is what it looks like. It's this very matte, very unchangeable finish, which can be cute. I like to use it as a base for other things. Because it does have that matte texture, it will take other things on top of it. So you can acrylic paint on top of it. You can do colored pencil on top of it. You can do all sorts of things with it. And it responds a lot like gesso or some other kind of primer. And this is pretty inexpensive, again. So I like it as a base for something else, but it can be kind of okay in and of itself. The last kind of paint I want to talk about is what's called milk paint. You'll notice up here, there's this little milk paint color thing. Milk paint is a traditional shaker finish that is derived from milk. It used to be that you would take milk and kind of distill it down to take the proteins out of it and then add lye to it to get this, what's referred to as a casein paint. It comes in powder form. It ships in bags in powder form. This one right here is, what color are you? Pumpkin, maybe? It's either pumpkin or marigold yellow, one of the two. I've had it for a million years, so I'm not sure. But the thing is, you take the powder and you add water to it. So you kind of take out what you need, you add water to it, you whip it up really as best as you can, work all the lumps out of it, and then apply it to your wood. The beauty of this is that it chemically bonds to your wood. It is not messing around. So if you think to yourself, I want my wood to be super protected and super, I would never want to ever have to remove this finish ever. Milk paint is great for that. It's a refinisher's nightmare because it legit bonds chemically to the material below it, and it actually discolors it. Milk paint, when applied, will burn the wood that's beneath it. It's crazy. So like if you milk painted mahogany, for example, and then sanded back through it, what you're going to see is the milk paint color, a layer of burgundy mahogany that has been burnt, and then the original mahogany color. Because this is caustic. It has lye in it. So even though this is a water-based finish, I use my gloves when I'm making it, when I'm mixing it, all that good stuff. It leaves behind a really chunky and gross surface though, like really chunky and gross. That's what this pink is right here. This is that salmon color. And if you take a look at it, you can see that it's not flat, it isn't shiny, it's kind of inconsistent. And that's because the pigment particles in this are like big. It's like making paint out of dirt. So you have to like sand between coats. You have to know that it's not going to yield a super consistent finish, but it's going to be something that's really hard and kind of awesome, ultimately. You can mix milk paint also with acrylic to augment it a little bit, and with itself to make new colors. But you'll notice that all of these colors are really pretty muted, right? And that's because they are using these natural pigments in the first place to get whatever. They do make milk paint that comes pre-mixed. It's not nearly as strong and good as this stuff. I do have some milk paint for you guys to use in the tool room, of all things, in a box, kind of like right towards the bottom. If we don't have the color you want, I don't have the color you want. That's just what it is. And you can order it. So you might want to start thinking about your finishes now, since you've only got another week after this to get everything done. Because it's going to make a difference in terms of how much time you need to set aside for it. Okay. Lastly, before we take a break, before we talk about spirit finishes, I want to talk about ebonizing solution. You can also change the color of your wood through patination or chemical changes, right? So just like I was saying that the milk paint burns the wood to change its color, so does other things. I have wood bleach in the other room, but I'm not going to demonstrate that right now because it takes too much time. I am going to show you this though, because this is awesome. This is ebonizing solution. Easy to make, very easy to make. It's got 2 ingredients. It's white vinegar and steel. When I make ebonizing solution, I make sure to buy white vinegar in a plastic jug because this has a huge off-gassing reaction as it's made, and that will, if you're like not regularly releasing the gas that's being produced, the jar can explode. So I only use plastic jugs when I'm doing this because if anything, they'll pop their top off and not explode, sending glass shards everywhere. What I do is I take a single pad of steel wool, 1 steel wool pad, and I make sure that it is completely submerged. You don't want it to float to the top. And then that essentially just dissolves over the course of however how long. It's also strangely important that as this is being created, you keep it away from the light. So I put it in a dark cupboard and I wait for it to dissolve. From there, I can filter it if I want to get any remaining steel wool particles out that might be in there. I mostly just let them settle at the bottom, and I only worry about maybe filtering it at the end. The way that this works is that this solution responds to the tannic acid that is naturally occurring in wood. So, you know, when you hear about wines and their tannins, oh, I can taste the tannins. That's what we're talking about. Wood has tannin in it. Some woods more than others. Oak has a lot of tannin in it. It's why a lot of wine barrels are made out of oak. Walnut has a huge amount of tannin in it. The more tannin is in the wood, the darker it's going to turn. So I actually brought a couple of samples out here to show you just what happens when you apply ebonizing solution to something. So this is poplar. Poplar, depending on where it grew, sometimes has a lot of tannin in it, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it responds, and sometimes it doesn't. Basswood, same thing. It's really kind of amazing. I'm just going to dip this guy in for a second, pull it out, and we'll see what happens. So this is walnut. Walnut has a lot of tannin in it. Look at the difference. Look at the color the walnut is turning. So the poplar is graying just a tiny little bit. The walnut has completely changed color. And it's just going to get darker. It's awesome. One of the cool things you can do also is that, I mean, look at that. It's even like leaving behind little black dots because there's so much tannin in the material. Look at how rad. Like this isn't going to change much, if at all. This is really awesome because when you do this isn't like applying a paint to it. You have chemically changed this material. And this isn't going to fade. It's not going to change. It's this color now. I will do this frequently if, like, the best example I can give you is my older sister bought an oak coffee table from some Amish people and she wanted it a coffee color. And I was like, well, that sucks. This is oak. How am I going to turn it a coffee color? Well, I started by ebonizing the whole thing to just give me a dark base. And then from there, I went ahead and I did put a stain on it. But it was, instead of looking kind of crappy and like whatever, by starting with that dark one and then augmenting the color from there, it looked a million times better, right? So the nice thing is that even though your wood doesn't necessarily have a lot of tannin in it to begin with, you can put tannin in it before you do this by making black tea. You make black tea, preferably not with hot water, and you take the tea and you paint that on your project. You let it soak in, and then your wood has tannin in it. It's pretty great. Once that's dry, then you can apply your ebonizing solution and it'll turn black or gray or whatever. Isn't that fun? I always love doing that. People are always like, holy crap, you know, because holy crap, right? Just as a quick aside, you can also, since this is a nice base then to apply other colors to, you can do the same thing with bleach. If you bleach your wood to kind of neutralize a color, to add something on top of it, that can be a really smart thing. The example I'm going to give is a friend from grad school made this really beautiful, interesting carved form out of mahogany, right? Mahogany, which is a very red color. And then she applied green dye to the whole thing. She wanted it to look sort of serpentine and snake-like and whatever. And it looked muddy and gross. And she was like, I don't understand why it looks muddy and gross. And I'm like, well, you added red and green together. Red and green make brown. If she had taken her project and bleached it first to neutralize the red, the green would have been really awesome. So, you know, just bear that in mind, that that's a thing. That you can ensure success just by doing a better degree of prep work. Okay, any questions so far? Yeah, Colby.
What was the name of the very first chemical you're describing? Now I can't find it, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I also keep mishearing you. Are you saying cannon or tannin?
Tannin, T-A-N-N-E-I-N. Yeah, tannins, ion. Rich tannin is a woodworker. Yeah, tannic acid, T-A-N-N-I-C. Let's write some of these down. Polyacrylic, acrylic paint, chalk paint, milk paint, and patinas. I'm calling them patinas because it's a chemical change in the wood. It's not a pigment that's applied, right? Any other questions so far? Let's take a good 15 minutes and then reconvene and we'll talk about spirit finishes. Spirit finishes. All right, so what makes a spirit finish a spirit finish? That's the real question. Again, it has to do with the kind of solvent. Spirit finishes rely on solvents that are evaporative. You might say to yourself, but Sarah, mineral spirits evaporates. That's true. But what's happening with like polyurethane and other kinds of resins is that as they are curing, they are cross-polymerizing. They're forming new chemical bonds and that leave behind that candy shell, right? With spirit finishes, that's not what's happening. As it evaporates out, what's left behind are just these polymers that are laying there, not interlocked. The most common of these finishes is shellac. Shellac is some great stuff, let me tell you. It's another super old finish. It's food safe. Does anybody know where shellac comes from? Like what it is the byproduct of? You're making a face. Say again? It is beetles. It's the lac beetle. L-A-C. It's an Indian insect, and shellac is produced from its, it produces a goo. I'm not sure if it's spit or feces or what, but the lac beetle makes this, essentially. Most of the time when you guys see shellac, it's going to look like this. It's going to come in a can, probably from Zinsser, which is a great, fabulous company. That's not true. When I endorse a product, I really stand by it, incidentally. I don't like this as shellac, but this company, Zinsser, makes great stuff. Holy crap. Their primer, mwah. Ready Patch, amazing. Anyway, so when shellac is originally harvested, it's a dark red color. It's what's called garnet shellac. And it gets separated out. That red color ends up being used in like food. It's a food additive called cochineal. Yeah, it's red. And then as this gets refined further and further down, it it gets lighter and lighter. So shellac will be it'll be described as garnet, orange, I think golden, blonde, and super blonde. The problem with the shellac that comes in a can here is that it says that it's been de-waxed. It's not really true. The product of making shellac involves, actually not even the product of making it. Shellac naturally has a lot of wax in it, and so as you're making it frequently or using it, what'll happen is there'll be this white scum on top. Where are they?
They're all the way across the road.
Are they really?
That's the people
Stop throwing your voice. Lean forward. That's what's happening. It's ventriloquism, a la landscape style. Anyway, but in order for the shellac to be in this form and stay viable, they've added chemicals to it that make it not cure up very hard. So this stuff always stays a little bit soft, and that sucks. Shellac also goes bad after a while, which is something I also didn't mention about the milk paint. Milk paint will go bad very quickly once you've started adding water. That's why I keep it in a jar, is to keep the air moisture out. That's why I only ever mix up as much as I need for a day, because by the next day, that chemical reaction will have worked itself out and the paint will be no good. Similarly, you never have any idea how old shellac is when you buy it in a can. That's why I make it myself. I make my own shellac by purchasing shellac flakes and then adding denatured alcohol to it. And in fact, I'm going to make some more right now because we are out. The way that it works, you buy the flakes in a bag. This full bag was $27.99 when I first bought it. So that tells you how expensive shellac flakes can be. It's usually referred to in a certain pound cut, like a 3-pound cut of shellac. I honestly have never been super positive about what that means in terms of viscosity. I wing it, frankly. I totally wing it. But shellac flakes, look at that. Aren't they pretty? They kind of look like spun sugar or caramel or something, right? If I wanted to, I could eat this. I'm not going to though. I'm not going to. So you can see they're real dry. All I'm going to do to make shellac now is add denatured alcohol. Now, they do make higher quality denatured alcohol specifically for making shellac. We don't have to worry about that. So all I've done is add enough to cover it plus a little bit more. Remember that alcohol evaporates very, very quickly, so you don't want to leave your shellac open. Just cover it over, give it a little swishy swish, and let it sit. If the shellac is still good, because even in this form, it can go bad. If it just doesn't break down and become a liquid, it's no good, and you have to buy new. But this should overnight dissolve completely into the alcohol, and this will be shellac. The only thing I want to make sure that I do is label it with the date, so that I know when I made it. And I don't have a Sharpie on me, so I'll do that at the end of class. So the real question is, why shellac? Why shellac instead of one of these other things? Shellac is magic. Magic. It has probably the single most important quality of any of these finishes, and that is that it is universally bonding. Shellac will stick to anything, and anything will stick to shellac. So, you may say to yourself, well, I've got this oil-based finish that I've got down here, but I want to put some water-based paint over it to augment it. But water-based finishes and oil-based finishes won't stick to one another, which is mostly true. Depends on the application, but that's too much information. I can put a layer of shellac down in between them, and they will totally bond to one another. It's one of the reasons why when I'm doing, again, if I'm like doing construction work and like refurbishing things, like my house, for example, is really old and I'm fixing it up. A lot of what's on the walls is oil-based paint. Oil-based paint, not the greatest for painting a latex over, obviously. I could put an oil-based primer on it, but even better is a shellac-based primer. If I treat it with shellac, I can paint it with anything I want, and it's gonna stick. It's the coolest. One of the other nice things about it, and I learned this the hard way, very sadly, it doesn't shift, because the solvent is alcohol. If I have drawn something with colored pencil on a piece of wood on a project, I can shellac it and it will stay. If I try to put a polyurethane over it or some other oil-based finish, it will dissolve the colored pencil because the colored pencil is wax. It's very sad. I did a whole lot of work once that I completely dissolved the second I hit it with finish. I was like, no! But you know, I took more of the finish and I kind of erased it then with that finish and started over. So shellac will stick to anything, and anything will stick to shellac. The drawback of shellac as a finish is that it remelts when more alcohol is applied to it. So if this were a tabletop surface, for example, like if this was on my bench tops and I brought a beer in here and spilled a little bit on the surface, it's going to destroy that surface. So it's not appropriate for use in like high traffic areas where you're going to drink. Kind of sucks. It also, because it will activate in more alcohol, you can't kind of keep building it and building it and building it. It doesn't work like that. There's diminishing returns of being able to deposit the shellac solids on something before it just starts melting into itself, right? So if you're thinking that you're going to build up 10 layers of it, you're not. You're going to build up maybe 2.5. It's also very difficult to apply well and make it look good because it dries so fast. Think about how fast alcohol evaporates. Like, I would take that finish, I would put down one brush stroke of it, and I would have to immediately put down another one right next to it. And like, if you're not putting that down so fast, it's just gonna look terrible. It's very sad. Makes me very sad when that happens. So I don't tend to use it much as a finish for really broad things. I use it as a bonding coat between things, or as a wipe-on finish for handheld stuff that, like, again, is food safe. You can eat shellac. I usually demonstrate by eating a tiny little chip. I'm not gonna do that today, but you get the idea. Yeah, so it has its place, it has its virtues. It's really, really amazing and critical stuff. But it doesn't do well for like big pieces of furniture. You might say to yourself, but Sarah, back in the day, people would shellac large pieces of furniture all the time. They would, and they would do it in a process that's called French polishing. Oh my God. French polishing involves taking shellac and oil and essentially suspending the shellac in oil and floating it on a surface. It takes 9 million years to apply. Like violins tend to be French polished, for example. That's what the finish is that's on there. And it's just a question of depositing really tiny amounts at a time. It's totally impractical to do on a large piece of furniture these days. And also, you know, it was done during a period of time when there wasn't electric light. The idea was that light would come in from outside, reflect off of this giant thing, and light the whole room. So just remember, small things, small things, yeah? Okay, one more finish to go. Also a spirit finish. Did you have a question or? Okay. And that's lacquer. Lacquer. Lacquer also is derived from a natural source. Does anybody know what it is? Anybody? So shellac comes from the lac beetle. Lacquer comes from nuts. Comes from seeds. Japanese and like Asian lacquers are from the cashew nut. Believe it or not. Poisonous cashew nut lacquer. The lacquer that you find like in cans and things or as a brushing thing, I honestly am not super familiar with. It also isn't going to shift your like oil-based finishes. Again, like you can seal up a drawing with a lacquer pretty decently and not have it do anything. I like to use lacquer when it matters that I'm not imparting another color. Like you can see that this is even still very yellow in shade, right? Lacquer is clear, like crystal clear. It's a lot more noxious though. It's like this is very safe, very non-toxic. This is super nasty. The natural lacquers that occur. So let's see. I just wanted to see what the cleanup was. Lacquer thinner. If you look at the ingredients in lacquer thinner, they're like 100% cancer causing. They're horrible. Lacquer tends to be a really, really great finish though for, again, small objects that you want to be really shiny. Oh my goodness. Like I see a lot of wood turners use lacquer because they can put their stuff on the lathe and just like spray it and it practically is drying as it's hitting that object. Yeah, so it has its benefits. I think probably it's not appropriate for any of the projects that you guys are working on right now. But you should know that it's an option. I tend to buy it not in brushing form, but in like spray can form. It's just easier. There's a line of products by Deft, D-E-F-T. Their spray lacquers are really quite nice. You know. So a couple of, well, any questions about finishes? Because I have a couple more things to say about finishing. Okay? All right. Finishing. When you're finishing, you should know a couple of big important things. One is that you're not going to throw away any of your rags or gloves or any of that stuff in the trash cans. All of your finishing supplies need to go in the combustibles can in the finishing room. Oil-based finishes in particular have this wonderful habit of spontaneously combusting and causing a fire. So if you are using any kind of anything, I don't even care if it's your acrylics mess, just get used to the idea that all of your rags, all of your gloves, all of everything needs to go in the combustibles can. This includes if you are like using a rag to put a finish on and you are going to come back later and you want to use that same rag, you better put that thing in the can. Do not leave it out. Like rags that are left out that are saturated in finish have a habit of starting on fire. Just don't do it. If you're at all concerned about it, you can take your rag and put it in your finish, completely submerged with it sealed up so that no oxygen can get at it. That's okay. You can fish it out again then to use later. But your rags can't be left out. If you have paper that you've put down to absorb any kind of finish, those need to go in the can. Like, don't give this building an opportunity to burn down, ultimately, is what that comes down to. So there's that. That's really critical. I think that's kind of obvious how critical that is and why it's critical. Secondly, finishing itself. And I probably should have led with this, but oh well. Finishing itself is not just the application of the finish. typically speaking, when you put a finish on something, you still have to refine that surface. Mr. Flexner refers to that as finishing the finish. So when I do things like put multiple coats of spar urethane on something, I don't just coat it and coat it and coat it. I'll, maybe put a couple of coats on, let them cure, and then I'm going to flatten them to make them better looking. Because there's dust and there's fur and there's all this, whatever that gets into stuff and makes it look gross. So as I'm going, I'm refining that surface even further every time. That's done with that finer sandpaper grits that I was talking to you guys about before, the 400, 600, and 800. I will sand between coats to keep, to refine what's there. Frequently, the very last thing I will do, depending, and of course, if you're like, well, what do I have to do with it? Read the can. Read the can. Sometimes it'll say sand with 220 between coats. I tend to not sand that low between coats, unless it's really crappy looking. Sorry, there's so many. I'm thinking of like 9 different things right now to tell you about how this works. But frequently, like maybe between my first and second coat of something, I'll sand with 400. And my second and third coat, I'll sand with 600. And my third and fourth coat, I'll sand with 800. And when the fourth coat is on there, I will then buff the whole thing out with 4O steel wool. So steel wool, it comes in different like degrees of coarseness, right? The finest one is quadruple 0, 0000, or 4O. We have 4O here that is special. It comes in a roll, and it doesn't have any oil in it, so it's not going to mess up your finish at all. It's, it was right there. I've got some in my office right now. But what you do is you unroll it, you clip off a little bit of it, and you use that. And by burnishing out that finish right at the end, it looks mwah, mwah, mwah. And then once I've steel wooled something, then I can wax it, and it's done. But do you hear how many steps that was? That was like 4 coats of finish, 3 rounds of sanding, steel wool, and then wax. So if you think to yourself the night before something's due, great, now I just have to finish it. What have you done? You've not accounted for enough time. Most of you guys though, like I said, if you are gonna put like an oil-based finish on, just get a coat of oil on and it's fine, and we can build it properly over the course of the rest of the semester, frankly. If it's something that you're gonna paint in and of itself can be a top coat, but frequently you're going to want to put polyacrylic over that to make it look, to seal up your paint job then too. So that's also an option. Water-based finishes cannot have steel wool be applied to them because it will rust. A water-based finish plus steel wool equals tiny black flecks all over your project. It sucks. So, just be aware that you really do need to make sure you're reading the can thoroughly of whatever it is that you're applying before you, even start refining your finish. I'm kind of going through all of the different errata in my head in terms of like, what's this random thing that you should know about finishing? Water-based finishes. I think this is the last thing I'm going to tell you about. Water-based finishes do this thing called raising the grain, right? So if your project gets wet, for example, for whatever reason, some of you may have noticed this if you've had to like wash out any glue or anything like that. When wood gets wet, the fibers that are kind of exposed on that top surface, they will expand and they'll kind of curl up. They'll be like, and you'll be like, what? I sanded this thing. Why does it feel terrible? So frequently, if I'm going to paint an object for my finish, I will do one of 2 things. I will do what's called pre-raising the grain. That's thing number 1. What that means is that I'll sand it to completion. I'll get it as gorgeous as I can. I will then wet the whole thing down. and it will, and then let it dry. And all of those fibers will go, whoop, and then I take that highest sandpaper grit that I went to, and I will very lightly defluff it. Very lightly. And then when I go to put my finish on, my water-based finish, it will be, it's not gonna then raise the grain, because any grain that was gonna be raised went ahead and got removed when I did the, you know, that initial light sanding there. The other thing that I sometimes do, depending on how many coats of paint I'm putting on something, if I'm gonna really, really coat the crap out of it, for example, I don't bother raising the grain. I just put down my first coat of paint, and that coat ends up like raising the grain and feeling really crappy. And what I do then is I sand the crap out of that one, and I flatten it. And then when I go to put the next coat of paint on, it's nice and smooth. It's sort of essentially trapped all those fibers in it, so it's not a problem. And I still end up with a really nice surface, but I've saved myself a step, because I was gonna have to probably sand between coats anyway. So it just means that I, you know, didn't have to pre-raise. I just worked that into that first paint application. Does that make sense? I know, it's a crap ton of information. It is a crap ton of very specific craft, you know, minutia. I would recommend to all of you that before you do your finish, do a sample. You'll all have some scraps sitting around of whatever. Go ahead and do a sample. Label it. Make sure you know what it is. Most of this stuff is going to be in the other room available to you. The things here that are not actually available to you are this. The rest of this is all you. So, oh my God, there's a squirrel behind you. Get out of here, you. Get. Don't come in, please. Thank you. No, it's too hot in here. Look at him, he's like. Cool. Anyway, so that's the basics of finishing. As you have really specific questions, you know, let me know. I will be happy to help you. I also want to give you fair warning at this point too, that